In 1541, in the heart of Hampton Court Palace, an aging and obese king heard for the first time the rumors that would destroy his fifth wife. Henry VIII, the most powerful monarch in England, the man who had beheaded ministers, queens and archbishops with the same coldness with which he signed decrees, fell to his knees in the Chapel Royal and wept. He did not weep for his own cruelty. He did not weep for the lives he had ruined. He wept because, in his mind, he was the victim. Once again, the 16-year-old girl he had crowned queen, the young woman he called his thornless rose, had committed the ultimate betrayal. She had loved other men before him, and possibly during his reign. And for that, she had to die. Welcome to Today I bring you the darkest, most disturbing, and most unjustly told story of the entire Tudor court. The story of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, Queen of England for less than 2 years, executed at 17 or 18 years of age, a girl who never had a chance from the first day of her life. But this is not just the story of a passive victim. It is the story of a family that sacrificed a child on the altar of power. It is the story of a court that used a teenager as a political pawn and discarded her the moment she was no longer useful. It is the story of a judicial system designed to produce a single outcome: the death of whomever the king wished to destroy. And above all, it is the story of how the abuse, vulnerability, and desperation of a young girl were transformed into crimes of treason under the most brutal laws of Tudor England. What drives an entire family to destroy itself in the pursuit of power? How can a legal system turn a victim into a criminal? And what does the story of Catherine Howard, the youngest, most vulnerable, and most neglected Queen England ever had, tell us about the nature of power? That's what we'll explore today on. Please like this video if this kind of story resonates with you. Comment below, do you think Catherine Howard was a traitor or a victim? And subscribe too, so you don't miss an episode. The story begins somewhere in England, on a date no one knows precisely. This uncertainty about the exact moment of her arrival into the world is not a mere accident of time. It is the first symptom of a problem that would define her entire life. No one with the power to protect her saw fit to pay attention to her. No one knows exactly when Catherine Howard was born. Modern historians debate between 1521 and 1525, with most leaning toward 1523 or 1524. This seemingly minor detail reveals something fundamental about her story. Catherine Howard was so insignificant to those around her that no one considered it necessary to record the exact moment of her arrival into the world. She was the youngest child, one among the many offspring of Lord Edmund Howard's second marriage to Joyce Culpeper. Lord Edmund was a minor nobleman of the powerful Howard family. Her father was a first cousin of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, making Catherine a cousin of the executed queen. But noble blood guaranteed nothing in 16th century England. Edmund Howard was a failure by almost every standard of his time. He had fought at Flodden in 1513 with military distinction, but this did not translate into wealth or real influence. He was burdened with chronic debt, numerous children to support, and the ever-present shadow of being the least successful branch of a family that included the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England. When Joyce Culpeper died, probably before 1528, Edmund Howard was left in dire financial straits with a multitude of young children. His solution was typical of impoverished nobles of the era: to redistribute his children among wealthier relatives who could provide for their upkeep and education. Catherine, then only 5 or 6 years old, was sent to live with her paternal grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess ran a sort of collective home in her mansions at Lambeth and Horsham, where dozens of young noble ladies and maids, daughters and nieces of families who paid for the privilege of having their daughters raised in an aristocratic environment, were educated. It was, in theory, a respectable establishment where the young women learned music, sewing, languages, and the manners necessary for navigating court life. In practice, it was a place of minimal supervision, excessive freedom, and enormous dangers for the girls who grew up within its walls. Duchess Agnes was hardly a watchful supervisor. She had a vast mansion, multiple administrative responsibilities, and little inclination to closely monitor what went on in the communal dormitories where the young women in her care slept together, sometimes dozens of them in the same space. These communal rooms became spaces where the younger girls were exposed to highly problematic power dynamics. There was no privacy. There were no clear nighttime supervision protocols. There were no adults regularly present during the hours of least supervision. And it was precisely in one of those dormitories that the chain of events began that would define and destroy Catherine Howard's life. She was approximately 12 or 13 years old when Henry Manox, the music teacher hired to teach her to play the virginals, began to abuse her. Manox was an adult with formal authority over his pupil. Catherine was a child with no mother, no father present, no one actively concerned for her daily well-being. What transpired between them was not, by any historical or contemporary standard, a voluntary relationship between equals. It was the abuse of a vulnerable child by an adult man, a child who sought affection wherever she could find it. Manox made romanticized claims to her, promised her love, and exploited the loneliness and need for affection of a half-orphan. Some of the documents from the period, including Manox's testimony during interrogations in 1541, indicate that the relationship was never consummated in sexual terms, but that Manox touched her inappropriately on a regular basis. When the relationship finally came to the Duchess's attention, she reprimanded Catherine, not Manox, severely but without taking any real action against the adult man who had abused a child in his care. Shortly afterward, Francis Dereham, a young clerk living at the Howard Manor, entered the picture. Dereham was about 20 when he began his relationship with Catherine, who was then 14 or 15. The dynamic was different in some respects. There was less of a power imbalance in terms of status, and the relationship was more prolonged and reciprocal than the episode with Manox. Dereham and Catherine called each other husband and wife in private, exchanged gifts and tokens of affection, and regularly slept together in the communal dormitories, while the other girls, who were fully aware of it, pretended not to see. According to the Tudor legal concept of betrothal or pre-contractual marriage, this kind of verbal commitment accompanied by conjugal life could legally constitute a valid marriage, even if not publicly recognized. This legal ambiguity, seemingly trivial at the time, would years later become the difference between treason and mere youthful imprudence. And because Henry VIII chose to interpret the facts in the most lethal way possible, with the assistance of lawyers trained to produce the outcome the king desired, that distinction would save no one. Sometime around 1539, Catherine Howard was sent to court to serve as a lady in waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife. She was then between 15 and 16 years old. The world of the Tudor court was radically different from the relatively sheltered and neglected world of the Duchess of Norfolk's manor. It was a universe of elaborate political intrigue, fragile alliances that could break in a matter of hours, and a brutal competition for royal favor that could make or break entire family fortunes. And Catherine Howard, with her bright youth, fresh beauty, spontaneous vitality, and complete lack of political sophistication, was immediately identified as a potentially valuable tool by the more calculating members of her family. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk and Catherine's uncle through her father, was one of the most astute and ruthless politicians at Henry's court. He had survived decades of Tudor politics precisely because he understood better than anyone how to convert his family's resources, including its youngest and most vulnerable members, into political capital. He had previously delivered his niece Anne Boleyn to royal attention, with dramatic consequences for Howard power in the first half of the 1530s and, eventually, catastrophic ones for Anne herself when she was beheaded in 1536. Now he had another young, pretty, and seemingly malleable niece. The parallel was not lost on anyone with deep knowledge of the court, including, presumably, the Duke himself. The marriage of Henry VIII to Anne of Cleves was, from the outset, a political and personal disaster of considerable proportions. The king, who had agreed to the marriage based on portraits generously painted by the artist Hans Holbein, found Anne physically unattractive by his own standards and temperamentally incompatible with his expectations. He called her, privately, and with the casual cruelty that characterized the king at his worst, the Mayor of Flanders. The marriage was never consummated, and Henry, who was 49, obese, had a chronic leg ulcer that constantly tormented him and sometimes left him unable to move easily, and felt old, sick, and deeply frustrated. In this context of physical and emotional dissatisfaction, he began to notice with increasing interest the lively and cheerful young woman who served among his wife's ladies-in-waiting. That the Howards orchestrated the king's attraction to Catherine seems clear to most historians who have studied this period. The girl was strategically placed in his path, presented in situations that maximized her visibility and appeal to the king. Whether Catherine fully understood what was happening to her is another question, and probably one with a negative answer. She was 15 or 16 years old, had grown up in an environment of neglectful supervision and normalized abuse, and suddenly the most powerful man in England, the king himself, the center of the entire court's universe, was paying attention to her, sending her gifts, looking at her with obvious desire. The emotions of a teenager in that situation, regardless of her intelligence or character, could hardly be processed with the detached perspective of adult political analysis. King Henry VIII became obsessed with Catherine Howard with the feverish intensity of a middle-aged man who believes he has found the fountain of youth. He sent her extravagant gifts, jewels, furs, estates. He called her his precious jewel, his priceless treasure. Looking at her, he saw not what she was, a vulnerable girl with a troubled past she didn't even fully understand, but what he desperately needed her to be: confirmation of his own vitality, the rejuvenation of a masculinity that time, illness, and excess had severely damaged. The marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled in July 1540 with the remarkable cooperation of Anne herself, who proved shrewd enough to recognize that negotiating an elegant exit was infinitely preferable to resisting the king's will. In return, Anne received a generous pension, property, the title of the king's sister, and the freedom to live in England without the crushing pressures of court life. It was, by all accounts, the best divorce negotiation of the entire Tudor era. 16 days after the annulment, on July 28, 1540, Henry VIII secretly married Catherine Howard. On the very day of the king's wedding, Thomas Cromwell, the most powerful minister Henry had had in the latter half of his reign and the architect of much of the Tudor administrative and religious reform, was beheaded on Tower Hill. Cromwell had been the principal promoter of the marriage to Anne of Cleves and had fallen from grace precisely because of this miscalculation. Norfolk, which had actively maneuvered for the downfall of Cromwell, its most formidable political rival, thus achieved a double and simultaneous triumph. It eliminated its most dangerous enemy from the political scene and crowned its niece Queen of England. The power of the Howard family was at its highest point in years, and its most useful tool was a 16-year-old girl who understood only a fraction of the game into which she had been placed. During the first months of her reign as Queen Consort, Catherine Howard was presented at court with all the honours due to the king's wife. She received her own household of servants, her own ladies-in-waiting, splendid jewels, and considerable estates. Henry displayed her with the possessive pride of someone who believes he has made the best deal in the world. He publicly called her his priceless jewel. In the early months of 1541, when the king embarked on a grand pacification tour of northern England, a region that had been shaken by the rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace years earlier, he took Catherine with him as a living symbol of his renewed energy and vitality. It was a public demonstration that the king was still a man in the prime of his life. The reality was more somber. He was 50 years old, gravely ill, and dependent on a teenage girl to sustain that illusion. But behind the glittering facade of Catherine Howard's reign, the gears of the Tudor machine of destruction had already begun to turn in ways she could neither see nor control. Henry VIII's court was a place where secrets were currency, where knowledge of others' vulnerabilities constituted real power, and where envy, ambition, and fear operated in overlapping layers of unseen intrigue. And Catherine Howard had secrets, or rather, several secrets, that people at various levels of her circle knew perfectly well. Henry Manox, her first abuser, was still around. he had never been punished for what he did. He continued to move in circles on the periphery of the Howards. Frances Derham, her teenage lover, not only still existed, but, with a boldness that in retrospect seemed suicidal, had applied for and obtained a position in the Queen's household as her private secretary. It is not entirely clear whether Catherine hired him out of lingering affection for someone she had known from her youth, out of fear of what he might reveal if he were not satisfied, or for some complex combination of both motivations. What is absolutely clear, however, is that Derham's presence at court in the Queen's own household was a ticking time bomb. But the most dangerous spark was another, and it burned in secret. Around the spring or summer of 1541, while the king was parading her around as his treasure during the royal tour, Catherine Howard began a relationship with Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was a distant cousin of Catherine's on her mother's side, a young man of about 25 who served as one of the gentlemen of the king's chamber. That is, one of Henry VIII's closest and most trusted personal attendants. He was young, had unrestricted access to the king's most private quarters, and was, in every sense, someone on whom Henry projected trust and affection. Culpeper and Catherine had known each other before. They had grown up in similar circles. What exactly transpired between Catherine and Culpeper remains a subject of genuine historical debate. Modern historians disagree on whether the relationship was consummated. Culpeper, during his interrogations, denied that there had been any sexual intercourse. Catherine made similar claims. But the two met secretly at night, through the active complicity of Lady Rochford, Jane Parker, the widow of the executed George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother, who acted as an intermediary and facilitator of these encounters. Lady Rochford opened doors, held entrances, and coordinated the times. And Catherine, the Queen Consort of England, wrote or dictated a letter to Culpeper in terms that made evident an affection that went beyond mere courtly friendship. That letter survived. Its contents were intimate, urgent, charged with a personal longing that no interpretation of platonic friendship could comfortably contain. And in the autumn of 1541, that letter fell into the hands of people who understood exactly what to do with it and what it meant for the power dynamics at the Tudor court. The Tudor court's surveillance and intelligence system was remarkably efficient in one specific area, gathering compromising information about people in high positions. Networks of informants existed at every level of the court hierarchy, from kitchen servants to Privy Council officials. Knowledge was power, and power at Henry VIII's court was measured in part by the ability to know things others would rather not know. In November 1541, while the king was attending morning mass at Hampton Court Chapel, a man named John Lascelles, a convicted Protestant with deep religious objections to the Howard family and what they stood for, approached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer with devastating information. His sister, Mary Lascelles, had served at the Duchess of Norfolk's manor and had first-hand knowledge of Catherine Howard's history with Derham. Cranmer, a first-rate political survivor as well as a sincere reformer, immediately grasped both the enormity of the information he possessed and the mortal danger of presenting it verbally to a king whose emotional reactions were unpredictable and potentially lethal, even to the messenger. He made a decision characteristic of his political style. He wrote a detailed and carefully worded memorandum and placed it on the king's pew in the chapel, so that Henry would find it alone, without an audience, without the pressure of reacting publicly. The king read the document during Mass, initially dismissing its contents as impossible and infamous, ordered an investigation, convinced it would prove his wife's innocence, and gradually sank over the following days as the investigation began to confirm and expand upon what the memorandum described. What followed was the Tudor machinery of destruction operating with all its terrible efficiency. The Privy Council met in emergency sessions. Arrest warrants were issued. Systematic interrogations began. Henry Manox was arrested and interrogated, and he provided information about his own relationship with Catherine years earlier, seemingly unaware that he was describing his own abusive behavior as if it were evidence of his victim's depravity. Francis Derham was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where he was subjected to interrogations that included torture. Under that pressure, Derham named everyone who knew about his relationship with Catherine and confirmed the details of that relationship with a thoroughness that made any alternative version impossible. Thomas Culper was arrested. Catherine's letter was presented as evidence. Lady Rochford was arrested. And one after another, people in Catherine Howard's circle began to provide. Under extreme pressure, or without any need for it, all the information the council needed to build the most devastating possible case of treason against the Queen and all those around her. Catherine was initially confined to her rooms at Hampton Court. When rumours of what was happening reached her, she suffered what contemporary sources describe as a breakdown of terror. She tried to run through the corridors toward the chapel where the king was praying, calling his name, hoping to reach him before it was too late. Guards intercepted her and returned her to her rooms. This episode gave rise to the persistent legend that her ghost roams the halls of Hampton Court, a legend vivid enough to be included in the palace's tourist tradition. What is historically verified is that she was moved, under increasingly harsh conditions and progressively stripped of her servants and ladies-in-waiting, first to Sion House and then to the Tower of London. The case against Catherine Howard revolved around two distinct but equally lethal sets of charges under existing Tudor law, or when that proved insufficient. Under legislation created specifically for this trial. The first concerned her relationship with Derham before her marriage to the king. Under existing Tudor legislation on betrothal and marriage contracts, if Catherine had been previously betrothed to Derham in what could be considered a valid pre-marriage contract, then her marriage to the king was potentially invalid. This in itself would have been politically devastating, but not necessarily a matter of life and death. However, the jurists in the king's service found a far more lethal interpretation, that Catherine had knowingly concealed this pre-contract from the king, that she had come to his bedchamber without disclosing that she was already betrothed or married to another man, which constituted deliberate fraud against the king, and by extension, a form of treason. The second set of charges, even more serious in its political and legal implications, concerned Thomas Culpeper. If Catherine, as queen consort to Henry VIII, had had a sexual relationship with another man, that was, without any possible ambiguity, under English law, high treason. The queen consort was bound by absolute fidelity to the king, not only by moral obligation, but also by constitutional reasons. The Queen's adultery cast doubt on the legitimacy of any heir who might be born, which amounted to a threat to the succession to the throne. The problem for the accusers was the genuine uncertainty as to whether the physical relationship had been consummated. The legal solution they devised was brutal in its legal creativity and its disregard for any principle of retroactive justice. In March 1542, Parliament passed an act declaring it treason for an impure woman to marry the king without revealing her past. This law was explicitly passed retroactively to cover Catherine Howard's situation. It was legislation designed not to regulate future conduct, but to kill a specific person already imprisoned awaiting her fate. The Tudor Parliament here functioned not as an independent legislative body, but as an instrument for ratifying the royal will. The interrogations of the main defendants revealed additional dimensions of the tragedy. Francis Derham, under torture, insisted that he and Catherine had been husband and wife in every sense, including sexually. This statement was potentially double-edged. If it constituted a valid prenuptial agreement, it could theoretically have reduced the charges against Catherine, as it indicated that a prior bond had existed, not mere lust without commitment. But at the same time, by confirming the nature of the relationship, it also sealed the accusation that Catherine had entered the king's bed under false pretenses. Thomas Culpeper was tried alongside Derham in December 1541, in a trial that lasted only a few hours and whose outcome was predetermined. The acquittal rate in high treason trials during Henry VIII's reign was virtually zero. Both were found guilty. On December 10, 1541, Thomas Culpeper was taken to Tyburn and beheaded, a relatively merciful method of execution that reflected his status as a gentleman of the bedchamber. Francis Derham, of lower social standing, and considered doubly guilty because his relationship with Catherine had predated the royal marriage and because, by appointing her to the position of secretary in his household, he had continued to pressure her afterward, suffered the maximum penalty for traitors of common status, He was hanged until nearly dead, taken down alive from the gallows, disemboweled, and his organs burned before him before he died. He was then quartered. His head and body parts were displayed in public places as a warning. The heads of Culpeper and Derham were placed on London Bridge, in full view of all who entered and left the city, as stark reminders of the price of getting too close to what the king considered exclusively his. They remained there for months. Lady Jane Rochford, who had acted as an active intermediary between Catherine and Culpeper, was arrested and subjected to interrogations of an intensity that exceeded her mental capacity. Documents from the time describe her suffering breakdowns that contemporaries called insanity, episodes we would recognize today as a severe psychotic episode triggered by the trauma of imprisonment, the terror of imminent execution, and possibly the guilt of knowing that her testimony had contributed to the conviction of others. This presented the legal process with a serious problem. English law did not permit the execution of people who had lost their reason, as they were considered incapable of being fully responsible for their actions. Once again, the solution was legislative and retroactive. Parliament passed a specific act that allowed the execution of people who had descended into insanity after committing the crime for which they had been convicted. This act, too, was passed to execute a specific individual. While all this was happening, Catherine Howard remained in the Tower of London, confined to rooms that had housed other illustrious prisoners before her, including her cousin Anne Boleyn. Historical records of her final weeks are fragmentary, but suggest a picture of terror interspersed with moments of resignation. She is said to have requested that the execution block be brought to her cell so she could practice positioning her head upon it, intending to do so with dignity when the time came. Whether this account is historically verifiable or a later legend reflecting the kind of courage her contemporaries admired is difficult to determine with certainty. What does seem clear is that, in the end, she found some way to prepare herself for the inevitable. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard ascended the scaffold in Tower Green, within the walls of the Tower of London, the same spot where Anne Boleyn had been executed less than 6 years earlier. She was 17 or 18 years old, though uncertainty about her exact date of birth means that even her age at death is not known for certain. Her last words were recorded in conflicting ways by those present. The most repeated, and most likely apocryphal, version is that she said she was dying a queen, but would have preferred to die Culpeper's wife. What we do know for certain is that she was beheaded with an axe, that the process was relatively quick, and that her body was buried without a headstone in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the tower walls. A few hours later, Lady Jane Rochford ascended the same scaffold. The woman who had served as an intermediary, who had survived the execution of her own husband years before, and who had now reached the absolute limit of what the human mind can endure, was executed that very day. 2 women dead on a February day in the courtyard of a medieval fortress, for crimes that had required the creation of new legislation to be defined. The Howard family was not completely destroyed, though it suffered considerable consequences. Duchess Agnes Howard, whose neglect had left Catherine unprotected in her childhood, was arrested and sent to the Tower of London on charges of misprision of treason, knowing of the treason and failing to report it in time. She was never executed. She spent months in prison, and her property was temporarily confiscated by the Crown. Several other members of the family and the Queen's household staff were arrested and interrogated. Some spent brief periods in prison. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, survived the crisis of 1541, though his position was weakened for years. The Howards' ability to recover from the disasters they themselves created by offering their own female relatives as instruments of political ambition was remarkable. The Tudor legal machinery demonstrated its perfect and terrifying efficiency in the case of Catherine Howard. The process followed recognizable and repeated phases throughout the reign of Henry VIII. The accusation could come from any direction: a political rival, a paid informant, a disgruntled acquaintance, a convicted Protestant with ideological objections. The arrest followed, usually at night to maximize the psychological impact. The interrogation in the Tower, with torture available for defendants of lower status, extracted names and facts that became further evidence, the trial, where the verdict was practically predetermined, and finally, the execution, the form of which varied according to the social standing of the condemned. Catherine Howard was a victim of every phase of this system, a system that her own family had helped to build, and from which she had tried to profit. There was no gradual denouement for Catherine Howard. There was no slow decline, no period of reflection or grace. Her fall was almost instantaneous in historical terms. In the space of a few weeks, she went from being the Queen Consort of England, publicly displayed on the Grand Royal Tour of the North, to a prisoner in the Tower, awaiting death. The speed of the destruction reflects the efficiency of the Tudor system of control, but it also brutally illustrates the complete absence of any independent power base that could have sustained it even for a time. In this, her case stands in revealing ways contrasting with those of other women who had navigated, or attempted to navigate, the equally treacherous waters of the Tudor court. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, had managed to withstand the king's campaign to annul her marriage for years, sustained by decades of institutional loyalty to him, the material and ideological support of the Holy Roman Empire through his nephew, Emperor Charles V, and her own unwavering theological conviction that her marriage to Henry was valid in God's eyes. Anne of Cleves had been politically pragmatic enough to negotiate her own exit with grace and material gain when she realized that the alternative was destruction. Even Anne Boleyn, who was eventually executed, had managed to hold on for years through her sharp political acumen, her alliances at court, and her ability to keep the king in a state of desire that made discarding her costly. Catherine Howard had none of those resources. She was too young, too inexperienced, and too devoid of genuine allies who would put her survival above their own security interests. Her family had used her as a tool and abandoned her the moment she became a burden. The Duke of Norfolk, upon learning of the investigations, wrote to the king to distance himself from his niece with a speed that spoke volumes about the nature of his supposed familial support. The swiftness of this distancing surprised no one who knew Norfolk. He was a survivor, and survivors of the Tudor court learned early on that familial solidarity had very precise limits when it conflicted with one's own safety. No one on the Privy Council raised their voice in defense of Catherine Howard. No one suggested that the charges were disproportionate to the acts. No one pointed out that condemning a person for acts committed as a child under the abuse of adults was morally questionable. No one questioned the retroactive application of the laws passed specifically to allow for her execution. The fear of the king was too great, the possibility of being identified as a sympathizer of a traitor too real. In the Tudor court, defending someone accused of high treason was to understand why Catherine's downfall was so swift and complete. It is necessary to understand the nature of power at the Tudor court more deeply. King Henry VIII was not simply a monarch with broad powers in the modern constitutional sense. He was, in the most literal and operational sense of the term, the absolute center of a system of patronage, favor, and terror that radiated from him to every level of English society. People at court had no loyalties independent of their loyalty to the king. They could not have them and survive. The Church of England was under his direct control since the Act of Supremacy of 1534. Parliament voted as he needed it to vote. The Privy Council was composed of men who owed their position, their wealth, and in many cases their lives to his continued support. In this system, the king's disgrace was automatically the disgrace of all those associated with the disgraced individual. Catherine Howard represented, for the courtiers at the time the investigations began, a potentially deadly source of political contagion. Anyone who had been associated with her, served in her household, received her favor, or even had regular social contact with her during her reign, was potentially suspected of knowing about her alleged crimes and failing to report them. The misprision of treason, the crime of knowing about treason and not reporting it to the authorities, was itself a serious offence that could carry severe penalties, including imprisonment and confiscation of property. This created a powerful and almost irresistible incentive for everyone in Catherine's circle to rush to demonstrate their distance from the situation and their unwavering loyalty to the king by reporting any information they might have. This is exactly what happened. The Tudor system of control worked in Catherine Howard's case with perfect efficiency precisely because all the players understood the price of non-cooperation. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, the women who had served her daily throughout her reign, who had slept in rooms adjacent to hers, who had been part of her immediate world and closely observed her behavior, were interrogated one after another by members of the Privy Council. Some provided information seemingly willingly, eager to proactively demonstrate their loyalty to the king. Others were more firmly pressured to talk. None refused to cooperate effectively with the investigations. The system left no room for solidarity or any other kind that could be interpreted as resistance to the royal will. The Tudor machinery of investigation and destruction was self-sustaining once set in motion. It produced its own fuel in the form of testimonies obtained under duress, which generated new lines of inquiry that yielded new testimonies. Catherine Howard, at the center of that machinery, had no chance of escape. Catherine Howard died on February 13, 1542. She was between 17 and 18 years old, a teenager whose entire life had been defined by the needs, interests, and decisions of the adults around her. Her body was buried without a headstone, alongside Anne Boleyn and others executed during the reign of Henry VIII, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. For centuries, her remains lay unidentified beneath the chapel floor. In the 19th century, during renovations commissioned by Queen Victoria, excavations allowed for the identification and marking of the remains of several of those buried there. A modern marble plaque, installed at that time, includes Catherine Howard's name alongside those of others who died by order of the Tudor and Stuart kings. King Henry VIII continued his life with the remarkable capacity for dissociation from reality that characterized his psychology in his later years. He wept intensely upon learning of Catherine's alleged betrayal, portrayed himself as the victim of wicked women, and proceeded to seek a new wife. 6 months after the execution, he was already courting Catherine Parr. The new marriage, his sixth, took place in July 1543. Catherine Parr was a 31-year-old woman, twice widowed, of remarkable intelligence, genuine religious conviction, and sufficient political sophistication to understand exactly what she was getting into. She outlived the king, who died in January 1547, and was the only one of his 6 wives to achieve that outcome. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham had died weeks before Catherine. Dereham, executed in the most brutal manner possible, left no verified final statement. Culpeper, whose execution was comparatively swift given his status, also left no such statement. Their heads remained on London Bridge for months as reminders of what happened to those who came improperly close to the person of the king. Duchess Agnes Howard survived her imprisonment, was released from the Tower after months of confinement, and lived until approximately 1545. She died without fatal consequences directly resulting from the years of neglect that had left a young girl unprotected in an environment where abuse was inevitable. Henry Manox, the first man to abuse Catherine when she was 12 or 13, disappeared from historical records after his interrogation in 1541. He survived. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, survived for decades longer, was arrested again in the final months of Henry's reign, and the entire legal process that led to the executions of February 1542 left visible marks on the Tudor court for years. Those who had served in Catherine Howard's household took time to regain positions of trust. Those who had been close to the Howards faced periods of heightened scrutiny and mistrust. The climate of suspicion that inevitably arose after every treason trial permeated the court for months, making everyone more cautious, quieter, and more careful with their words and gestures. It was one of the intended side effects of the Tudor terror. It not only eliminated the specific individuals it targeted, but also produced an environment of pervasive self-censorship that made control easier. The Howard family's reputation took years to fully recover. The Duke of Norfolk, who had orchestrated Catherine's presentation to the king and reaped political benefits during the first months of that reign, lived the following years in a significant shadow. He was not excluded from the Privy Council, nor did he formally lose his titles, but his real influence was diminished. Other political factions at court, particularly those who favoured religious reform and opposed the conservative Catholicism the Howards represented, exploited the family's weakness to advance their own agendas. Tudor politics, in this sense, was a system of interconnected vessels. The fall of one automatically meant the rise of their rivals, for ordinary English people outside the court. Catherine Howard's story was likely known primarily through rumours, ballads, and market conversations. The execution of queens was not an everyday occurrence, even during Henry VIII's execution-prolific reign. Anne Boleyn had been the first queen executed in English history, an event of enormous psychological impact on the population. Catherine Howard's execution, just 6 years later, confirmed that the position of queen consort did not confer immunity from the king's power. This had implications for how the English of the period perceived royal marriage, female power, and the limits of the protection that status could provide. Although sources on popular opinion during this period are scarce and difficult to interpret, there is evidence that Catherine's death elicited more sadness and sympathy than Anne Boleyn's. Perhaps because her evident youth and vulnerability made it harder to apply the ambitious femme fatale narrative that had accompanied Anne's trial. Hampton Court Palace, where Catherine desperately tried to reach the king in the initial moments of his downfall, remains one of England's most popular tourist destinations. Visitors can tour the gallery popularly known as the Haunted Gallery, where, according to tradition, Catherine's ghost still runs about shouting the king's name. Hampton Court invests considerable resources in maintaining and narrating these stories, which says something interesting about how contemporary popular culture processes the history of Tudor power as Gothic drama, as ghost entertainment, rather than as an analysis of systems of abuse and control. Catherine Howard's story deserves to be told with greater depth and rigour than a mere haunted palace anecdote. Catherine Howard's story has been interpreted in radically different ways throughout the centuries. For a long time, historians and biographers treated her primarily as a secondary figure in the story of Henry VIII, defined by her relationship with the king and the scandals that led to his death, rather than as an individual whose story deserves to be understood on her own terms. Her story was frequently told with a subtle but persistent undertone of guilt. She was frivolous, indiscreet, and had brought her fate upon herself through her immoral behaviour. This narrative is, in light of modern standards of understanding child abuse, power dynamics, and trauma, deeply inadequate and revealing of the biases of each era. The work of more recent historians, particularly since the late 20th century, and with greater intensity in the 21st, has reframed Catherine Howard's story in more complex, fairer, and historically more rigorous ways. The relationship with Manox is now clearly recognized as the abuse of a 12 or 13-year-old girl by an adult in a position of pedagogical authority. The relationship with Derham, though more ambiguous in its dynamics, also occurred when Catherine was a teenager in an environment of neglectful supervision, subjected to the pressures of an older adult in a context where she had neither the resources nor the role models to resist or fully understand what was happening. The fact that these relationships were later used against her as evidence of her moral or criminal culpability says more about the Tudor power system and its priorities than about Catherine Howard's character. The legal legacy of Catherine Howard's case is particularly dark and revealing. The practice of creating retroactive legislation to convict specific individuals, the acts that condemned her for not revealing her past, and that allowed Jane Rochford's execution despite her mental state, starkly illustrate how, in Tudor England, Parliament could be used as an instrument of the royal executive's desires rather than as an independent legislative body. This pattern, using legal and parliamentary institutions to produce politically desired outcomes instead of genuine justice, is one of the most revealing aspects of the actual workings of power in the late Tudor period. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London remains Catherine Howard's final resting place. Visitors to the tower can visit the area where she was buried, although the identification of her specific remains remains uncertain given the age of the burials and the conditions under which the 19th century excavations were carried out. In more recent forensic analyses, researchers have attempted to use modern techniques to more accurately identify the remains of those buried there, with partial results that have not been able to resolve all the uncertainties. Catherine Howard, in a profound and literal sense, remains partly anonymous in death, much as she was in life, a person whose exact dates of birth and death are uncertain, whose face has not been preserved in any portrait definitively verified as authentic, whose voice we know only through documents written primarily by her accusers and the interrogators of those around her. It is a historical absence that speaks eloquently of how the Tudor power system treated those without power of their own. Catherine Howard's story raises questions about systemic versus individual responsibility that remain urgent today. The system that destroyed her required multiple components operating simultaneously and in harmony. The ambition of a noble family that used a child as a tool for political advancement. The negligence of an adult authority figure who left her unprotected in an environment where abuse was predictable. The conduct of adult men who exploited her vulnerability. The paranoia of a king who turned his personal insecurity into an institutional machine of death. And a legal system designed to produce the outcomes those in power desired regardless of evidence or principles of justice. None of these elements operated in isolation. They all fed off each other in a cycle that made Catherine Howard's destruction almost inevitable from the moment she was sent to her grandmother's manor as a young child, without genuine adult protection. The lessons of this story are not relics of the past. There is another aspect of Catherine Howard's legacy that gender historians have emphasized in recent decades. The way her story illustrates the specific mechanisms of social control over women in Tudor England. Women of the Tudor elite lived within a set of extremely precise expectations and restrictions. They were expected to be virgins at marriage, faithful during it, and discreet in all aspects of their public and private lives. Any deviation from these norms, regardless of the circumstances that produced it, could be used against them, with consequences that no male equivalent would have faced. Thomas Culpeper, who had his own documented problematic behavior in court records before his relationship with Catherine, including accusations of rape and murder in at least one historical source, was executed for his relationship with the Queen. But his story did not generate the same kind of moral analysis of his character that Catherine's story generated of hers. The sexual double standard of Tudor society was applied with surgical precision in the case of Catherine Howard. What would have been invisible or irrelevant in a man's history, premarital relationships under vulnerable circumstances, was made into the cornerstone of a capital treason case. The Tudor legal system, in this sense, was not gender neutral. It was an instrument that codified and applied rules of control over women in ways that had no symmetrical equivalent for men. The act that made it illegal for an impure woman to marry the king without revealing her past had no equivalent for men. There was no legislation to punish the king for his own sexual past before each marriage, nor any to protect his wives from being punished for what he had done with them. The impact of Catherine Howard's story on subsequent culture and literature has been considerable, though intermittent. She appears in historical novels, television series, and documentaries, sometimes treated with the depth her story deserves, and at other times as a decorative figure in the broader narrative of Henry VIII's reign. The most recent and influential adaptation in Anglo-Saxon popular culture has been the series Wolf Hall and its sequel, based on the novels by Hilary Mantel, which, although primarily focused on Thomas Cromwell, treat Catherine Howard's period with remarkable historical subtlety. The portrayal of Catherine in these adaptations shows her as what she was, a helpless young woman facing forces that completely overwhelmed her. For historians specializing in the Tudor period, the case of Catherine Howard continues to generate active research. Questions about the exact nature of her relationships with Derham and Culpeper, the degree of voluntariness in her decisions, whether the letter to Culpeper was actually written by her or dictated to a scribe, and what she truly understood of the legal implications of her past actions when she entered into the royal marriage, remain the subject of analysis and debate. The available evidence is sufficient to reconstruct the general outline of events, but insufficient to definitively resolve all the questions those events raise. In this sense, Catherine Howard remains partly a historical mystery, a person we know primarily through the documents produced by the trial that destroyed her, not through her own directly preserved words. And so we conclude the story of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, Queen of England for less than 2 years, executed before she turned 20. Her story is that of a girl who never had a real chance, placed by her family's interests in the path of a man whose power was absolute and whose capacity for destruction knew no effective institutional limits. Her legacy is written not in victories or conquests, but in what her story reveals about the immense damage a system of absolute power can inflict when it encounters a person utterly powerless to resist it. She died on a block in Tower Green on February 13, 1542, buried without a headstone next to her cousin, Anne Boleyn, 2 women from the same family, destroyed by the same man less than 6 years apart. For centuries, her story was told as that of a reckless, frivolous, or morally weak woman with greater historical understanding and a clearer picture of the dynamics of abuse and power. We can see her for what she was, the youngest and most vulnerable victim of one of the most efficient machines of destruction that political history has ever recorded. The Howard family, who used her as a tool and abandoned her when she became a burden, suffered consequences but survived. The king who ordered her death lived 5 more years, remarried, and died in his bed surrounded by doctors and advisors. The system that destroyed her continued to function without fundamental changes. Only Catherine Howard and the men who had been in her circle paid the ultimate price, and they paid it for conduct that, by any standard of justice other than the expediency of power, was the responsibility of a system that had surrounded them since childhood, not of a girl who never had the resources to fully understand the world into which she was born. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like. It's the most direct way to help us continue producing this kind of in-depth historical content. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you consider Catherine Howard to have made irresponsible decisions with foreseeable consequences? Or was she fundamentally a victim of a system designed to destroy her, regardless of her actions? It's a genuine and complex historical debate, and I'm interested to know where you stand. Subscribe to if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. We'll continue exploring the power structures that used and destroyed real people, the stories that official history prefers to simplify, and the systems that remain recognizable today, even though they take different forms. The past is written in power and blood. Understanding it honestly helps us recognize its patterns wherever they appear. Before I conclude, I want to reflect for a moment on why this kind of story matters beyond mere historical entertainment. Catherine Howard's story is not just a curiosity from the distant Tudor past. It is a case study in how power systems truly operate, with all their brutality and efficiency, when there are no effective institutional limits to restrain them. It is the story of how a person's vulnerability, brought about by circumstances beyond her control, the age at which she lost her mother, her father's poverty, the neglectful environment in which she was raised, the adults who abused her, can be transformed by a power system into a tool for her destruction. It is also the story of how institutions, the Tudor Parliament in this case, can be emptied of their function as a check on executive power and transformed into instruments for ratifying the will of those already in power. The retroactive laws that condemned Catherine Howard were not anomalies. They were the logical expression of a system where the king's power had no genuine institutional limits. The Parliament that passed the Treason Act against her was not exercising its independent legislative function. It was carrying out an order. And it is, ultimately, the story of how historical memory can, for centuries, mistreat the victims of unjust power systems, adding to the original injustice, the injustice of a narrative that makes them partially responsible for what happened to them. Catherine Howard did not bring her fate upon herself. A family used her. A system destroyed her. A king ordered her death. She was 17 or 18 years old and never had the resources to resist any of those forces. To remember her honestly, to understand her story in its true complexity, is the only form of justice that time can offer to someone whose remains lie unmarked in a chapel within the walls of the Tower of London.